Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Jennifer Pepito, author, speaker, founder of The Peaceful Press, and host of Restoration Home with Jennifer Pepito. Jennifer and I are going to talk about how she got involved in podcasting back in 2017, the relationship she's seen between her writing and podcasting, and her streamlined workflow for producing the show so she hardly has to touch episodes after recording. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Jennifer Pepito. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
I'm excited to be here, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I first learned about your podcast from Dorinda Wilson when I had her on a few months back at this point, and she said that you would be a great guest for this podcast, and I looked you up and saw that you've been publishing episodes of your podcast, Restoration Home with Jennifer Pepito, and you're over 120 episodes in at this point, and you've been a part of another podcast previously, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But for folks that are not familiar with you, I'm just going to read the description of your show to give them an idea of what your podcast is about. And it says, in this show, we talk about the peaceful path to connected families and restored communities. It's all about the simple things that we do as women that have the potential to save the world. So that's a great description of the show, and I'm glad to have you on today to learn more about your podcasting journey. So to start off, let's go back a little bit. You've been a homeschool mom for over 25 years with 7 children along that journey, and then you started The Peaceful Press in 2016. So I'd love to know what led you to start that business and ministry back in 2016.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you point out that it is business/ministry because I've been homeschooling for a long time. I really adore being with my children, but I saw that in Christian homeschooling resources, there actually was a real lack of child development insight. So many of them are kind of almost copying the public schools, but just tacking on some Bible lessons. And as I had been studying and researching, not just like people like Charlotte Mason or even Maria Montessori, who, some of them are more Christian maybe than others. But as I've been studying that and child development, I realized that, for one thing, we need to give children a little bit more margin to actually, be in a relationship with God and not just like be cramming them full of facts at a higher speed than public schools are doing it. And the other thing I realized is that, young children actually have a lot of developmental needs that in this culture today, they're not necessarily getting. And so part of, don't provoke your child to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord is giving them those opportunities to grow in their skills, their abilities, not just academically, but also physically and emotionally. And so we incorporate things like practical life skills, which give them opportunities to help out in the family, but they also build these essential motor skills, or we incorporate fine and large motor skill activities because so many children today are living almost very one-dimensional lives. Like they're not doing as much playing in the mud as they used to, or, working with their parents on projects. And those kinds of activities really build the underlying developmental skills that children need to be academically excellent.
Nice. Yeah, and so then you started creating resources that walked families through what that would look like in their homeschool environment. Tell me a little bit about that and what those look like, and if people go to your website, what they should expect.
Yeah. So my first resource was called The Peaceful Preschool. And it, really kind of initiated families into creating an atmosphere of peace, helping young children work through challenges, setting up your homeschool atmosphere in a way to be more conducive to learning and less sort of conflict oriented. And so that was the first resource. And then, I could see many of my friends using something called Classical Conversations, which highlights literature, but it really doesn't incorporate much in terms of Christian literature or more inspiring, poetry, things like that. It's a lot more about memory work in the early years. And that broke my heart a little bit because the early years are such a wonderful time to, teach children like beautiful memory verses and poetry and read them stories that really highlight virtue. And so with my resources, The Playful Pioneers, and then the next resource I did was called The Precious People, and I followed it with the Kind Kingdom. Each one of those elementary age resources followed that same cycle as Classical Conversations, a 3-year history cycle, but we really incorporated the most beautiful poetry. Like we have some Gerard Manley Hopkins. I mean, the earth is filled with the grandeur of God. Or Emily Dickinson, Hope is a Thing with Feathers, which perches in the soul. Poetry that really kind of stirs our heart towards God instead of just focusing on sort of, the mundane. It's like children come into the world with so much hunger for God in a sense and so much like awe of God in a sense. And when we don't sort of take advantage of those sensitive periods in a child's life and just fill them with the most utilitarian information, I think we really miss out on training them up in, like I said, the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So my elementary resources really highlight beauty and truth through poetry and great literature and conversations and projects. And it is a tough, it's a tough world we live in because so many people are using charter schools, which the charter schools don't really want to let them buy anything with Christian content with charter school money, but our resources are very affordable. So families who are using a public school funds could still, they could buy the resource and then pay for the printing with the public school funds, things like that.
Gotcha. Neat. That's very cool. So about a year after you started the Peaceful Press, you got involved with a homeschooling podcast called Wild and Free. And so I'd love to know how you got involved with that show.
Yeah, and I might have been podcasting for them actually before I started the Peaceful Press.
Okay.
I had spoken at a couple of their conferences and I had written a few articles for their magazine. And so, as an interviewee, she eventually asked me to interview other guests for the podcast. And that was such a fun opportunity. They did the production of that. And so all I had to do was the interviews, which was a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah. So, and then a few years later, in August of 2022, your book Mothering by the Book published, and then followed by your podcast Restoration Home, which you started then in October of that same year. So what led you to write that book and then soon after start your own podcast?
Yeah. As a mom, I could see that so many homeschool moms and even just traditional schooling moms were struggling with a lot of fear, and it was stealing the joy of motherhood. And so Mothering by the Book is really my story of overcoming fear through the books I was reading out loud to my children. And, that came out, like you said, I think in the spring of 2022. But by the time that book came out, I already had the idea for my next book. And I had signed a 2-book contract with my publisher. So the next book was going to be about the rule of St. Benedict, about how that kind of ancient rule of life or sort of cultural context could help our civilization gain its footing again, because we've sort of gone off the rails as a culture in so many ways. So I started the podcast to kind of talk about the themes that were going to be in the book. And it was really exciting to just highlight these principles of work and prayer and order, principles that some of them have kind of been neglected in our modern culture. So each of the conversations each month still is circled around these ideas of virtue and having values in our family that really translate into more peaceful and connected families.
Nice. Yeah. So as you've been doing the podcast for a while and you're continuing to write, how have you seen writing and podcasting being a great relationship to help you develop content?
Wow. I mean, it's incredible how it all works together, right? Because I'm writing my 3rd book right now. And as I'm researching for that, it's giving me so many, quotes and ideas that I can then talk about in my newsletter. I send out a weekly newsletter to homeschool families. Some of those newsletters become blog posts and then become Instagram posts. And then I talk about the quotes and things I'm learning on the podcast. So it for sure all goes together. And I think that as people made in the image of God, there is a sense that we should be growing. Do you know what I mean? It's like if you look at the world he made, there's a continual growth process. And so just, taking in information is, I think, essential for having any ideas. And, our homeschool curriculum is based on the Charlotte Mason method. And one of her mottos is education is atmosphere, a discipline, and a life. And a life is built on ideas. And so if we're not filling our minds with beautiful ideas, then we're not going to have beautiful content to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're also very passionate about research. So, what are some ways that the podcast has fueled that passion and given you the opportunity to have conversations with people and dig into some concepts and take that passion and play it out?
Yeah, that is one of the things I do love about podcasting is that having conversations with people is so easy, but I just love the chance to ask them questions. Some of them might not be the easiest questions either. Like I podcasted with Katie Faust of Them Before Us. She's a passionate defender of the traditional family. I podcasted with Sally Clarkson and Jenny Urich. So some people who are, they're big researchers themselves or in some ways on the cutting edge of shaping culture. And so those kinds of conversations do really spark new ideas in me. And I don't always 100% agree with every single thing my guests say, even. And I think that's okay to be able to talk through ideas and, hopefully, I would want to be careful that I wasn't platforming somebody whose ideas weren't constructive to virtue. But also, I just love the ability in Christian context to sort of work out our own salvation with fear and trembling.
Yeah.
There's a sense that there's so many different ideas in the world and so many different ways of even living out faith. And I love that we can sort of honor each other. And that's one of the things I love about my community, the Restoration Home community. We are all on this mission to raise up connected families and restored communities. But in the community, there are Catholic moms, there's charismatic moms, there's conservative Christian moms, so there's quite a wide variety actually of denominational backgrounds or, theological streams. And yet we can come together with these shared values of connecting with our children and training them in virtue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about the community a little bit. I love this idea of taking a concept and podcasting through it, but then have an avenue in which people can actually have conversations around it. It's a unique aspect that, as you're building an audience with a podcast can frequently not necessarily happen unless you're being really intentional. So how has that been fruitful and helpful to those that are in the community?
It's been really incredible because so often we read a book or hear a podcast where someone is talking about a better way to live, having some new habit or some new vision. But then we many times don't put that into action at all because we have no accountability. We have no community
Sure.
around
Yeah.
that. And that's a big part of this motto is connected families and restored communities because our work towards being a more connected families and not just connected to each other, but connected to God so that we are being transformed in his image, that work should start to trickle out into culture. But when we are in community with other people who are doing the same work, it creates a lot of power and even sort of some like a catalyst or it kind of like moves things a little faster than maybe if we were just doing it by ourselves. And so in our community, each month we have different virtues that we're working on that are related to these habits. So like last month, the virtue was restoration. And so we worked on logging our time and looking our children in the eyes. This month, the virtue is on work. And so we are putting in the work of reading out loud to our children or even decluttering our homes so we can have a little bit more peace. So each month, there's some habits for connection, some habits for sort of restoration that we're working on together. And then like we turn in our points every month and we have a retreat at the end of the year to celebrate. And so there's all these ways that we're sort of holding each other up. And, it's like there's that verse that talks about how a person by himself can be easily conquered, but a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And so this is, what we're building basically is just a really strong community of people who are supporting each other in this pursuit of virtuous families.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think that's a super powerful way to be able to, hey, I'm bringing different guests and knowledge and these different things that you should be working on in your life, and these things are important. But yeah, having a way in which, okay, now let's do this thing together. I think that's huge. And having a community around the podcast and around the business tree is super beneficial. And it's cool to hear that perspective and how that's been working really well for you. Your daughter, Emily, has been a frequent part of the podcast going all the way back to episode 1. I'd love to hear about the decision to involve her on the show and how it's been beneficial for both you and your audience.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have her as my podcast host. She's a very thoughtful, intelligent person. She's my oldest daughter. And I don't hide the fact that I made a lot of mistakes in parenting, but I also was a very intentional parent. And so I think it's been really encouraging for people to listen to our story and see, like, here's some ways that I would have done things different or some things that were problematic, even in the way I raised my children. And yet also to see just how thoughtful and well spoken Emily is. She just got a Juris Doctorate from Queen's University in the UK. She is just an excellent person. And so I love having these conversations with her and really going deep into some of these topics that are of interest to us and our families that we're ministering to.
Yeah, that's great. So you publish a weekly podcast, which for those that are also doing the same thing know that it can easily become a grind. So describe some of your rhythms and habits that enable you to create weekly podcast episodes.
Yeah, Tim, I'm a big fan of systems. And, I think that to be able to accomplish what I've accomplished, and I've written 3 books, I've created, many different curriculums, I'm on my 3rd book. And I have a weekly podcast, like you said. And so I have a weekly time blocking. Thursday mornings, I do the recordings. I, do my best to schedule even for podcasts outside of my own on those days. I also time block, when I do my newsletters and blogging. And this year I'm not homeschooling full time. My son is doing some classes that are sort of augmenting his high school education. But, in previous years, I was full-time homeschooling when I started the podcast and started my business. And so it really has taken a lot of intentionality to make sure I'm present with my children, that we have evenings together. Like, I don't work at night. That's family time for us. But while I'm in a book writing season, I might get up a little bit earlier. And thankfully, my son does the podcast production. So my podcasts get delivered into Dropbox. I use something called Zencaster, and then my son downloads them. He does the audio production, and then my daughter, who's my co-host, creates the graphics and the show notes and uploads it to Podbean, which is the platform we use to kind of have it go out to Spotify and Apple and other podcast platforms.
That's really cool. Yeah, that's great. So what have you found over the years as you've been doing this have been great ways to promote the podcast and grow your audience?
One of the biggest ways that my business was built, my business tree, was on Instagram, honestly.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I got on Instagram around 2014. And I think it was a lot different at the time. And so some of the ways that I built it at the time maybe wouldn't be as possible today. But, I did things like commenting on other people's posts or doing giveaways with people or, a few times my posts got shared by bigger platforms. And then that obviously brought in new audiences. So those are some of the things I've done in the past. I also regularly post the graphics for my podcast on, Instagram and Facebook. One of the things that we're working towards is having a weekly blog post that is about the podcast, but we also have a large newsletter list. And so the podcast link goes out to that newsletter list every week as well.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. All those things built around it. So what roles, you talked about social media a little bit, have you got into YouTube at all as part of that strategy, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I have not delved into YouTube as much, Tim, because it takes so much more production money to make things beautiful on YouTube. And so I have a few things. My account is called The Peaceful Press, at The Peaceful Press on YouTube. And it hasn't been super populated. Some of the podcasts are on there just as audio episodes. And then I have some shorts that are really beautiful with winter science experiments and picture books for preschoolers, things like that. So we do have some awesome little crafts for kids on our YouTube, and some of our, like I said, podcast episodes are on there, but we haven't put in like a ton of effort into populating our YouTube channel.
Yeah, I recommend people that at least put your audio on YouTube, because it is the number one place that people are finding podcasts these days, which is kind of crazy to think about. But with that being the case, as much as possible, at least being present there with the audio only version is great. And then, I do the same thing. I put shorts on there just for awareness, take the same thing that I'm posting on other social platforms and throw it over there. And that really helps bring awareness, is basically what it's doing at that point, and helping people that connect to go over to the podcast and actually take a listen.
Yeah, that's a great tip, Tim. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the show notes, it says that this great conversation is made possible by Peaceful Press. And so with that, you're self-supporting, which is the same way that I do my show. I don't have any sponsors or anything that are supporting the show. What have been the direct and indirect ways that the podcast has led to monetization for your business?
Yeah, it actually has been working really well. I might at some point take sponsored posts. I'm not ruling that out at all because there are some things that I'd love for my community to find out about. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for
We
sure.
don't produce every single thing that a homeschool family would need. And so, if I'm doing something for my health, because of, one of the things we talk about is health, or if there's like a math curriculum, I don't produce a math curriculum. But we have seen that, about 1 in 3 to 5 of our purchases, because we recently did a post-purchase survey on our
Mm,
Peaceful Press site, and 1 in 5 of those purchases were coming from the podcast. So
that's
we
great.
are very grateful when people hear about us and learn more about our philosophy. And I think that's one thing, with homeschool curriculum, when we started back in 2016, there wasn't really much out there for
Mhm.
homeschool curriculum. And there have been a lot of copycats in the last few years. And that does make it harder to get your name out there. There's a lot of options. People are overwhelmed with so many options. But I think when they hear my daughter talking and see how well educated she is with this method of education, and when we start to explain to people more about how a literature-based education can really cultivate virtue in your family and help your family love learning, and how the projects help your children have better aptitude for STEM skills later on, I think that helps sell them on the concept because, we're not a traditional boxed curriculum. It does take sometimes more faith to do more of a Charlotte Mason method because you can't always prove learning with a workbook
Mm,
sheet.
yeah.
But the sad thing is that worksheet style learning is actually very shallow. It doesn't really get into your children's character and their minds and really shape how they think and give them great, beautiful ideas that could transform culture. And so we're very passionate about well-educated children who are educated for virtue and for even statesmanship as opposed to just sort of a surface education.
Yeah, nice. What would you say has been some opportunities that have come up because you've been podcasting for so long that you may not have had otherwise?
Yeah, for sure, because our podcast, the Restoration Home podcast, has been in the top 100 on Apple Podcasts. It's most often in the top 200. And so because our podcast is charting like that, we've had some really fantastic authors reach out to us
Mm,
that we might not have had the opportunity to, if we were just, for instance, doing our homeschool curriculum, we might not have gotten to have some of these really fantastic conversations. So I'm super grateful for, these chances that I've had to talk to people like Ruth Cho Simons or Mary Heffernan. There's some really interesting people that we've gotten to have, Sally Clarkson, of course. Some of these people have been such interesting conversations. And then obviously, I'm sure when you have somebody who is a bigger name, like we had Shauna Holman on our podcast, that podcast got a lot of listens, so that helps the whole podcast, like a rising tide rises
right.
all ships, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the workflow for your show. As you're doing a weekly podcast and your daughter's involved and your son's involved in the production, what does that normally look like for you as you're planning an episode all the way through publishing?
Yeah, we have a Google Doc. It's a shared Google Doc that has the podcast plan for the year. And this year, because we're focusing on a specific theme of virtue, we have 52 different virtues that we're talking about
Mm,
throughout the year in our community. The podcast is kind of aligning with those virtues as well. And then I have been working on getting my Calendly link a little bit more efficient because in the past I would set up every single podcast myself. And so,
hmm.
I would kind of do the connection point.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
what I've been doing more recently is getting my Calendly set up properly instead of just having like kind of a loose schedule on there. I've been actually really blocking out those times that are available and then just sending potential guests the Calendly link or having my daughter who does some of my personal assistant work, having her send that. And so
Nice.
right now we have podcasts scheduled out through May. So we're doing
That's
great
great.
with getting them scheduled ahead of time. And then those podcasts are all just getting dropped right into the Dropbox. My son can easily check in. My daughter can check in and see what podcast is next because they're all scheduled out so efficiently. And then we're ready to go. So I don't touch it hardly at all after I've recorded. Like I said, it goes in the
Yeah.
Dropbox. My son does the audio. My daughter does the show notes. It gets uploaded. I have a designer who posts it to Instagram. And then lately she's been collaborating with me on Instagram so that the podcast posts are in my feed as well. It's been great
Yeah.
because I honestly don't love being on Instagram. I haven't really been doing a lot of my own posts lately. And so having these fantastic quotes from the podcast hitting my Instagram have, helped kind of populate my social media as well. So it's been
Nice.
a
Yeah.
real big win.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, as you look back on the last several years hosting Restoration Home, how has podcasting helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, for one thing, it's helped refine it because as you're
Mm,
having conversations with people, you're always kind of learning and talking and having this opportunity to sort of sort through other people's ideas and see how they align with yours and how yours align. And so I think
yeah,
it's definitely been very refining for my mission to just understand where people are coming from, where they're going. And obviously, what we're interested in changes from season to season. We had, I think it was the first year we started podcasting, we were in a little bit of a harder season as a family. And so during that season, we did a lot of podcasts on attachment theory and on, talking to people who talk about boundaries or people who talk about certain kinds of therapies like internal family systems. Now we're in a different season where we're talking more about proactive things like virtue, or we're talking about, organizing our homes even. Like, so I
mm,
think that the
yeah,
podcast definitely changes a little bit depending on the season that we're in. But one of the mistakes I've made, if you want to hear mistakes, is
sure, yeah,
for a little while, because my podcast got a little bit more notice, I was starting to get all these like, podcast asks that actually
sure,
weren't really aligned with my message.
hmm,
You know, businesses or people who, maybe they had some kind of interesting work, but it really was only going to reach like a small portion of the people who listen to my podcast. And so I've had to get a little bit more clear on wait, what is the message of the podcast? Will this conversation help promote the message of the podcast? Because it was, I do as a business owner, one of my struggles is learning to say no and learning to be more disciplined with my no. And so I've been thankful to have had that revelation so that now the people I am, having conversations with are really going to help bring the podcast up. I have Cass Spear coming on. She has a big ministry. Chelsea Joe has a podcast called Systematize Your Life. So another really great platform, Dana K. White. So some of these people who are coming on in the next months have bigger podcasts than me. And that's going to really help my podcast grow as well.
yeah, that's great insight. And I learned the same thing as I was producing the Entre Leadership podcast when I worked at Ramsey Solutions. Because again, you get so many pitches from people and it's so easy to want to say yes, but it's a lot harder to filter through and be like, okay, how is this going to be valuable to the audience? Does this fit with what we're trying to do with this show? But yeah, as much as you can start to dial that in as you're doing, it just leads to a better experience for you. You're having better conversations because it's stuff that you're wanting to talk about as well. And it's a better product for your audience as they listen because it's stuff that you care about and it aligns with what the show's about. So that's a great insight and always better to learn from other people's mistakes as much as we can, right? So
Absolutely.
all right. Well, we'll jump into the high pass segment now where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So the first question is, what's been your favorite part about homeschooling your 7 children?
Oh, I love homeschooling my kids. It's been so much fun. I think one of the best parts is just all the experiences we've had. We were missionaries for a few years. And so like during those missionary years, we went camping once on the Sea of Cortez. And it was summer, like it was like June, and we were kayaking, and my son fell out of the kayak into like a pod of jellyfish. So it was this, scary moment, but it became this like kind of wild memory. I mean, to be kayaking on the Sea of Cortez in itself was so out of this world in a way. And then to be in the midst of all these jellyfish for a nature loving child was incredible. We helped the poor in Mexico. We helped with an orphanage. At another point in our lives, we went to Italy and we're in like a 2,000-year-old olive grove listening to a guy talk about the ruins. There was like these old mosaic tiles on the ground in there. There was like part of an old Pompeian villa or something. So and even smaller experiences. Like we spent a lot of time on hikes or going on field trips to different factories. We did this Mrs. Fields sticker factory tour. I think it's still around as a company, but it was one of the most fantastic field trips
Hmm.
we'd ever been on. So just so many wonderful experiences with my children. And we've been really big on projects. We incorporate projects in the Peaceful Press curriculum as part of our STEM learning. So
Hmm.
like when we were learning about the Romans, we built an aqueduct, and it was like a model aqueduct, in a pan, and it had different tubes. So we would use like the inside of a paper towel roll, for instance, as the tube, and, tape it up or whatever so it could funnel water, so you could really see how they would get water from one place to another. Or when we were learning about early transportation, early machines or power, we made water wheels that we all went down to the creek together and stuck the water wheel in the creek and saw how, it made the wheel spin. The movement of the water made the wheel spin. So we've had so much fun together and just really, really happy memories. And I think in my research on joy, one of the topics I've studied in the last bit is there's a book called 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People. And they talk a lot about how when we're in a joy relational space, it helps us learn. And I think it's really sad that so many homeschool parents and so many kids in schools, there's just no joy in learning. Like it's all tedium. It's all just one assignment after the other. So they have really no mental space to even have any joy. And so then, I don't think children are being enculturated for joy. Like no wonder they just get on their phones and zone out. They're just so dead inside in a way. And so I love that my curriculum and my experiences with my children have really helped us to understand what joy looks like. And so they have like a baseline to go back to. And, the Bible says in his presence is fullness of joy. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. And I think that having these tastes of joy help us know what we're looking for in terms of our relationship with God. And, it just transforms culture when we learn from a relational state of joy.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, I haven't necessarily thought about that, but yeah, that totally the joy aspect of things that as you're wanting to learn things, if you're excited about it and it's bringing you joy, are more likely to be engaging and to be fun. And that's great. What's been your favorite activity to do as you live in the mountains of Northern California?
We definitely love hiking. We love being by creeks and rivers. And at this point in our lives, we have a small sailboat on a small lake.
Mm,
And so we spend many summer afternoons on the sailboat. So definitely anything by water is what brings our family joy.
nice. That's cool. What's one of your favorite books that you've read recently?
That's a great question. Definitely the 4 Habits of Joy-Filled People
Mm,
sticks out to me. I also really adore Elizabeth Goudge. I just recently read The Castle on the Hill and her Elliott family trilogy, starting with, well, I think Pilgrim Inn is probably my favorite of that trilogy. But right now I have like 20 homeschool books on my nightstand because I'm writing a book about homeschooling. So I'm
yeah,
sort of deep into research on that. And not that I'm not enjoying those books, but so many of I've read before. And so now I'm reading them with a different perspective. But
sure. Yeah.
yeah, I definitely love books that really kind of highlight how good God is and sort of turn our hearts and affection towards him.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question in this segment. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how Restoration Home has impacted their life?
I get a lot of beautiful stories from our Restoration Home community. It's one
Sure.
of the
Yeah.
highlights of doing this work is just seeing how people's families are being transformed. But, looking at some of the reviews, like Brooke said that you can feel Jennifer's passion for wholesome families. And I always leave inspired to be a better wife and more intentional mother. So that's been so encouraging. Another mom said, "It's such a beautiful podcast. I always enjoy and appreciate her wholesome honesty and the way she doesn't interrupt her guests." So, and appreciates the godly wisdom. So, that is one of the gifts I really appreciate anytime people leave a review, because it's just so encouraging to know that what you're doing matters. Another mom said, "This is my favorite podcast. Each episode is thoughtful, grace-filled, and inspiring. And her conversation with guests feel like sipping coffee on the front porch with friends." So those kinds of reviews obviously bring a lot of joy and encouragement,
Yeah.
because it is, a big deal kind of to like put yourself out there, to have conversations, to have honest conversations, to,
Mm,
put my daughter's words
Yeah.
out there in public. All of that is definitely a big leap of faith in a sense. And so it's very sweet when people leave a review.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, as we close today's episode, who else do you know that would be a great guest for this podcast?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So many of the people that I've mentioned as guests on mine are fantastic as guests. Like I just recently podcasted with a woman named Hannah Keeley, and she has an incredible ministry helping moms overcome mom fog. I had a really interesting conversation with Clear Cherry Reeves. She has a business creating Christian content for moms. So there's been so many really interesting conversations. Amy Nival is another one. I don't think she has her own podcast, but she's part of the Connected Family sort of ministry. So yes, Deb Weekly is another one who has a great ministry in parenting and really mentoring moms.
Nice. Very cool. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time today to share about your podcasting journey and encourage us with your wisdom and sharing the mistakes that you've made. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, what a joy to get to chat with you. Thanks so much for having me today, Tim.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Jennifer and hearing about her podcasting journey, starting with her involvement with Wild and Free to starting her own podcast, Restoration Home, and then that relationship she's seen between her writing and her podcasting. You can listen to Restoration Home with Jennifer Pepito with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to support this show, and together we'll help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Kate Battistelli, author, speaker, former actress in the Broadway theater world, and a host of the Mom to Mom podcast. Kate and I are going to talk about their unique format with 3 generations of moms having conversations around motherhood, how she and her co-hosts leverage technology to plan and record the podcast as they live in different states, and why they decided to press pause on the podcast for about a year before coming back with their latest season. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.